The broadcast reached Kaelreth at his desk at 11:47 station time, in the middle of reviewing a trade transit report that he had been finding genuinely interesting, which was the kind of thing that happened to you after 7 years in a posting. You found interesting the things the posting made interesting, and trade transit patterns in the human compact's outer corridor systems were, if you knew how to read them, a remarkably precise indicator of civilian economic confidence in a way that most diplomatic observers missed because they were looking at the political signals and not the shipping data. He was reading the shipping data when the broadcast came through on the public diplomatic channel. He read it. He read it again, which was not a habit he had but which the situation seemed to require. He read it a third time because the third reading was the one where you confirmed that the thing the first two readings had produced was actually what the document said, and not what you had somehow mistakenly read into it. It was what the document said. The collective's governing council had voted, 11-4, to issue a formal declaration of war against the interstellar human compact. The declaration cited border pressure, expansion trajectory concerns, a strategic assessment that current engagement was preferable to future engagement, and a military capability comparison that placed the collective fleet at a favorable ratio to the assessed human military force. The declaration had been transmitted on all public diplomatic channels simultaneously, which meant every embassy, every trade office, every diplomatic mission in the region had received it at the same moment, which meant there was no window for quiet management, no possibility of back-channel adjustment before the public record was established. It was public, it was official, it was real. Kaelreth sat at his desk for approximately 30 seconds. Then he laughed. He was aware, while it was happening, that laughing was not the appropriate professional response to a war declaration involving his government. He was aware that a 43-year-old career diplomat with 18 years of service laughing at his government's official diplomatic communications was precisely the kind of behavior that ended careers and confirmed the assessments of people who believed, as High Counselor Mervsal apparently believed, that extended postings produced compromised professional judgment. He laughed anyway, because the alternative was something he couldn't manage in a professional setting, and because the laugh was not the laugh of amusement, and because in 7 years of studying humans, he had encountered their concept of gallows humor, the specific response to situations that were too terrible to be met with anything except the involuntary acknowledgement of the enormity of the gap between what was happening and what should be happening. And he understood in this moment what that felt like from the inside. The gap between what the collective thought it had just done and what it had actually just done was the most terrible thing he had ever encountered in 18 years of diplomatic work. The laugh was the only available response that fit the gap. He stopped laughing. He picked up his personal communicator and opened the contact he had added to it 4 years ago, after the third or fourth time he and Dr. Sierra Walsh had ended a conversation so late that the official communication channels had logged him as off-duty, and he had needed to reach her anyway because the thought was still going, and he needed to finish it with someone who could follow it. He sent 3 words, "I'm so sorry." He put the communicator down and went back to the broadcast and read it again, because he was a professional and professionalism required complete information, even when complete information was already complete in all the ways that mattered. The military capability comparison in the declaration assessed the human compact's active fleet at approximately 80 vessels of varying capability. Kaelreth had, in his 14th report, estimated the actual figure at something considerably higher than that, and the 14th report had been written 8 months ago, and the compact's production capacity in those 8 months had been, based on the shipping data he had been reading this morning with genuine professional interest, running at a pace that suggested the 14-month-old figure in his report was already conservative. He thought about this. He thought about the 60 vessels, the military deployment plan. He had seen the outline of it in the council briefing materials that came through the diplomatic channels, which was one of the advantages of being a senior attaché, called for sending into human space in 3 weeks. He thought about the specific shape of what 60 collective vessels entering human space in 3 weeks was going to encounter. The communicator chimed. Walsh's response, "I know, come over." He closed the trade transit report, which he would not be returning to today, and he went. High Counselor Mervsal had been in governing council service for 22 years, which was long enough to have developed the specific quality of experienced institutional power, which was the quality of someone who understood how the institution worked and had proven, repeatedly, that their understanding was accurate, and whose understanding had therefore become the institution's own self-understanding in a particular way. He was not stupid. He was the product of a system that rewarded a specific kind of intelligence, the intelligence of institutional navigation, of building coalitions, of assessing the likely responses of known actors to known stimuli and calibrating action accordingly. This intelligence was genuine, and it had served the collective well for 22 years, and it had served Mervsal himself extremely well across a career that had moved from junior council secretary to high counselor in a trajectory that was not accidental. The case he had made to the council for the declaration was rational within the framework he was working with. He had presented it over 4 sessions, building the argument methodically, addressing the objections as they arose, and they had arisen. 4 council members had voted against, but 4 was not enough. His case, human expansion, was accelerating. Human space now bordered collective territory on 2 corridor approaches, which was 2 more approaches than had bordered collective territory 5 years ago, which extrapolated to a rate of expansion that would produce significant territorial pressure within a decade. The military capability assessment showed a collective fleet-to-human fleet ratio that was currently favorable and would become less favorable over time because the humans were building. Engagement now was strategically preferable to engagement later. The council should act while the acting was still a reasonable military proposition. The intelligence assessment he had used was current. It had been compiled by the appropriate office using the appropriate sources, public records, trade ship observations, 3 operatives who had spent a combined total of 8 months embedded in human-accessible spaces over the past 4 years. It was thorough by the standards of what thorough meant for this kind of assessment. He had reviewed the diplomatic attaché reports from Kael'reth's posting. He had reviewed the summaries specifically, because the full reports were 340 pages in the most recent case, and the summaries were designed to convey the essential content without requiring council members to read primary research documents. The summaries had struck him as thorough but skewed. There was a pattern in them, across all 7 years, of emphasizing human capability and downplaying human vulnerability, of finding complexity and depth in human institutional structures that the intelligence assessments did not find, of reaching conclusions that differed from the intelligence consensus in the direction of greater human capability in almost every case. This pattern was consistent with what the professional literature on diplomatic immersion described as immersion bias. A long-posting diplomat, particularly one who had requested extension twice, who consistently found the subject of their posting more impressive than other assessments found it, whose reports systematically diverged from the consensus in the direction of greater sympathy for the subject. This was the profile of a diplomat who had become too close to their work. He had not dismissed Kael'reth. He had discounted him appropriately, which was the correct professional response to suspected immersion bias. He had weighted the intelligence assessments more heavily, because the intelligence assessments were compiled by people who had not spent 7 years developing proximity to the subject. He was wrong about this. He would understand that he was wrong in stages over the following days, in the specific way that being wrong about something important revealed itself, not all at once, but in accumulating evidence that each individually might be manageable, and that together became undeniable. The first stage arrived 3 hours after the declaration was transmitted, when his aide told him that the diplomatic office was receiving an emergency priority communication request from attaché Kael'Reth. Merv Saul authorized a 24-hour response time, which was half the standard 48-hour protocol for non-emergency communications, which he considered an appropriate concession to Kael'Reth's flagged urgency, while maintaining the procedural order that prevented every anxious diplomat from having direct access to the Council's schedule. He returned to the military deployment review. Walsh's office was not large. It had the comfortable density of a space occupied by someone who worked in it seriously. Data tablets stacked in patterns that looked random and were not, a physical bookshelf that she maintained, because she had found that physical books created a different relationship with content than digital ones, and the different relationship was worth the shelf space, a window that showed the station's exterior docking approach and the ships moving through it, which she had once told Kael'Reth she watched when she was thinking because the movement helped. She was at her desk when he arrived. She had a cup of something warm in her hand and she was not looking at her work. She was looking at the window. He sat in the chair across from her desk that had been, over 4 years, informally designated his by the accumulation of time spent in it. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "How bad is it?" He said, "The assessment they used put the human fleet at approximately 80 vessels." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, 80. Yes. She looked at her cup, the actual number. I put it at considerably higher in my 14th report. That was 8 months ago. Based on the production data I was reviewing this morning before the broadcast arrived, the actual current number is likely higher than what I put in the 14th report. Walsh looked at the window. She watched a cargo freighter move through the docking approach with the patient efficiency of a vessel that had done this route many times. She said, "What did they base the 80 on?" Public records, trade ship observations, 3 intelligence operatives with a combined 8 months of field time. She was quiet for a moment. 8 months combined. Yes. Over how many years? The past 4. She looked back at him. She had an expression that he had learned to read over 4 years, which was the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they had already known was coming, and were taking a moment to simply be present with before moving forward. She said, "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me the fleet numbers are the worst of it." He said, "The fleet numbers are not the worst of it." She nodded slowly. She set down her cup. "Tell me what you told them," she said. "In the reports, the things they didn't read." Kael'Reth had spent 7 years compiling information, and 18 years learning how to present information to people who needed to receive it accurately. He organized what he knew in the way he organized everything, which was beginning with what was most precisely quantifiable and moving toward what was most difficult to quantify and most important to understand. He said, "The fleet numbers. The actual fleet is not 80 vessels. It has not been 80 vessels for some time. The public records that the intelligence assessment used are accurate as records but are not complete. The Compact's military production includes a distributed component that doesn't fully appear in the public records because it was designed not to appear there. I identified it through the shipping data, which shows materials flows inconsistent with the public fleet size." Walsh nodded. This was not new information to her. She was a historian, and she knew the fleet numbers better than the intelligence operatives did, but she was letting him present it in sequence because the sequence mattered. "The doctrinal characteristics," he continued. "The intelligence assessment modeled human military response on the doctrine of the species the collective has encountered before, which is the doctrine of a military that engages to achieve territorial objectives. Human military doctrine is different. They do not engage to achieve territorial objectives in the conventional sense. They engage to achieve conditions under which the thing they are protecting continues. The difference sounds semantic. It is not. It produces a different kind of force with different operational characteristics. Specifically, Walsh said. Specifically, a force optimized for territorial objectives stops when the objectives are achieved or when the cost exceeds the value of the objectives. A force optimized for conditions continues until the conditions are achieved, and the conditions, in the human case, are defined by the threat being removed rather than by territorial gains. You cannot offer them a compromised territorial arrangement that satisfies them. The territory is not the point. Walsh said, the point is that you stopped threatening them. Yes. And the collective has just issued a formal declaration of war, which is a threat in the most official available form. Yes. She looked at the window again. The cargo freighter had completed its approach. A passenger vessel was beginning its transit in the opposite direction. She said, "What else?" "The institutional depth," he said. "The compact's military has been in continuous operational activity for approximately 30 years. 30 years of actual engagements, actual combat, actual problems that required actual solutions rather than theoretical ones. The solutions that worked are in the institutional memory. The solutions that didn't work are in the institutional memory. The gap between what the doctrine says and what the situation requires. Every military has that gap, and the gap is crossed by experience. And 30 years of experience crossing, it produces a different force than a force that has been in fewer engagements and has crossed it less." Walsh said, "We've been fighting in one form or another for 10,000 years." "I know," he said. "I mean the spacefaring military specifically. The institutional memory of the spacefaring military goes back 30 years. The cultural memory that informs it goes back much further, but the operational institutional memory, the specific accumulated knowledge of what space combat requires, is 30 years deep, and it has been updated continuously." She was quiet for a moment. He said, "And then the cultural framework." She looked at him. He said, "You told me 3 years ago about the concept of earned response. Do you remember?" "Yes." "Tell me again. I want to make sure I understand it correctly." She thought for a moment, organizing the way she organized when she was going to say something precisely rather than approximately. She said, "Earned response is the human concept. It's not formally named. It's a pattern that historians identify. It's the principle that the appropriate response to an action is proportional not to the immediate provocation, but to the full weight of what the provocation represents. It means that when humans respond to something, the response carries the weight of the history of that kind of provocation, not just the weight of the immediate instance. So a war declaration is not simply a war declaration. A war declaration is the latest instance of a category of event that humans have been experiencing for 10,000 years. The response to it carries the weight of 10,000 years of responses to that category of event. Not consciously, not as a deliberate policy, but structurally. It's in how they think about it, how they feel about it, how their institutions respond to it. Kael'reth sat with this for a moment. He had included a version of it in his 14th report, in the section on cultural framework, in language that he had calibrated carefully to communicate the concept to readers who had not spent 7 years among humans. He thought now that his calibration had perhaps been too careful, that he had softened it into something that could be acknowledged without being felt. "The collective thinks it has made a political decision," he said. "The council thinks it has assessed a strategic situation, determined the optimal course of action, and initiated the appropriate response. They think they are in a political process that will conclude politically." Walsh said, "Yes." "They are not in a political process." She said, "No. They are in a memory. They have entered humanity's memory in a specific way, and human memory." Doesn't diminish, he said. You told me this 3 years ago when we were discussing the Draken campaign. You said that the compact still talks about the specific details of conflicts that ended before most of its citizens were born, not as history, as a present. As present, she confirmed. The debts are current. The wrongs are current. The things that happen to people who have been dead for 50 years are things that living people feel personally. It's not irrational, it's structural. It's how a civilization maintains continuity across generations. It's how you know who you are when the people who built the first version of you are gone. Kael'reth said, and the Declaration is now in that structure. Yes. Permanently. Yes. Regardless of what happens next, regardless of whether the Declaration is withdrawn, whether there is a diplomatic resolution, whether nothing further happens, the Declaration has been made. It is in the record. It is a thing that humans know their civilization experienced, and humans who are not yet born will know it and will feel it in the way that humans feel things their civilization experienced before they were born. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I've developed immersion bias and my assessment is distorted." She said, "You want me to tell you that so you'll feel better about what's coming?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I can't, you're not wrong." He went back to his office. It was 1600 station time, which meant he had been in Walsh's office for approximately 4 hours, which was not the longest they had talked, but was longer than the situation had felt like it was taking. He sat at his desk and he pulled up his reports. 14 of them. The first one filed 7 years ago, when he had been on the posting for 8 months, and had enough experience of the subject to have something precise to say. And the last one filed 8 months ago, 340 pages. The assessment he had spent 4 months writing, and that had received a 3-day acknowledgement and 0 substantive response. He read them in sequence. He had never done this before. He had written them sequentially, each one building on the previous ones in the way that longitudinal assessments built, but he had written them as individual documents and filed them as individual documents and thought of them as individual documents. Reading them in sequence was different. Reading them in sequence, he could see the arc, the picture that no single report contained but that all 14 together contained, the picture of a civilization that had been developing over 7 years in ways that were visible if you were present and tracking, and that were not visible if you were looking at snapshots. The fleet size arc. In Report 1, he had noted that the public records suggested a fleet of approximately 40 vessels with production capacity suggesting growth to 60 or 70 within 3 years. In Report 7, he had revised the estimate upward based on shipping data analysis and noted that the public records were not complete. In Report 14, he had assessed the actual fleet at a figure that was significantly higher than 80, and had flagged the distributed production component that didn't appear in public records. Doctrinal arc. In Report 1, he had noted that human military doctrine appeared to differ from regional norms in ways he did not yet fully understand. In Report 5, he had begun to articulate the difference, the conditions-based orientation rather than territorial objectives orientation. In Report 11, he had traced the doctrinal evolution through 30 years of operational history and shown how each significant engagement had refined and deepened the doctrine in specific ways. In Report 14, he had described the doctrine as mature in a way that was qualitatively different from the doctrine of forces, with less operational depth. The cultural framework arc. This one was the hardest to trace because it was the hardest to quantify, and he had been cautious with it, more cautious than he should have been, because the caution was the professional habit of an analyst who knew that cultural claims required more substantiation than capability claims, and who had perhaps overapplied that caution in a way that softened the sharpest edges of what he was observing. But it was there in the sequence. Report 3, a preliminary observation about human memory and its relationship to historical events as present rather than past. Report 6, a more developed analysis of the earned response pattern across several historical examples. Report 10, a full section on what he now called the memory structure, the way human civilization maintained continuity across generations through a specific relationship with historical experience that other species did not share in the same form. Report 14, a paragraph in the executive summary that read, "The most significant and least quantifiable aspect of human military capability is the cultural framework within which military decisions are made. A declaration of war against the compact would not be processed by human institutional structures as a political event to be resolved politically. It would enter the memory structure that defines human civilizational continuity. The implications of this are significant and are elaborated in Section 7. Section 7 was 12 pages. It was the most carefully written 12 pages he had produced in 18 years of diplomatic service, and it communicated, as precisely as he had been able to communicate it, the thing that Walsh had said more simply. They don't want war and they're very good at it, and the combination is more dangerous than either one alone. He thought about the acknowledgement for Report 14, 3 days, no response. He thought about High Counselor Mervsall's assessment that his reports reflected immersion bias. He thought about what immersion bias meant as a concept, which was the compromising of professional objectivity through excessive proximity to the subject. He thought about whether his 7 years had compromised his objectivity or had given him a different kind of objectivity, the objectivity of actually understanding rather than the objectivity of maintaining distance from understanding. He thought about this distinction for a long time. Then he opened a new document. He did not begin with an executive summary. He did not begin with methodology or scope or any of the formal apparatus of the 14 reports that had preceded this one. He began with a sentence. "I have written 14 assessments of human military and cultural capability over 7 years in this posting. The Council's declaration of war was not informed by those assessments. I am writing this report because I believe the Council needs to understand what those assessments contain before the military deployment. They have authorized enters human space in 3 weeks." He wrote for 4 hours. The 15th report was 6 pages. It was the most direct document he had written in his career. It did not hedge. It did not caveat. It did not apply the professional caution that had softened the edges of his 14 previous reports into something that could be acknowledged without being felt. It said what the situation required him to say in the language the situation required him to use, which was the language of someone who had spent 7 years understanding something and was now telling people who needed to understand it what it was. He addressed it to High Counselor Mervsall directly, using the emergency direct address protocol that he had never used in 18 years of service, and that was going to create the kind of professional friction that careers did not easily survive. He used it because the alternative to using it was watching the collective's fleet enter human space in 3 weeks with a council that did not have the information it needed. And the alternative to that was something he was not able to be professionally composed about. He submitted the report at 21:43 station time. Then he sat in his office and waited. Mervsall received the emergency protocol notification at 600 the following morning. His aide presented it with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that they were delivering something their supervisor was not going to be immediately pleased by, which was the emergency priority flag, combined with the direct address protocol, combined with the sender being the attaché whose request for communication had already been deprioritized once. Mervsall looked at the notification. He looked at it with the specific attention of a man who had spent 22 years in institutional power and knew, from that experience, when something required his attention regardless of whether he wanted to give it. He authorized the full communication. He read the 6 pages. He read them twice. Then he looked at the attached document that the Human Compact's diplomatic office had transmitted 14 hours after the declaration, the two-paragraph response, and the 43 engagement operational history. He had received this document the previous evening and had set it aside for morning review. He read it now. He read the operational history for 3 hours. He was a man who had spent 22 years assessing strategic situations, and he was sitting with a document that described, in factual operational terms, what human forces had done in 30 years of engagements, and the document was not consistent with the 80-vessel assessment that had informed his case to the Council, and the inconsistency was not small. At the end of 3 hours, he authorized Kael'reth's request for immediate audience. The communication went through the emergency channel, which Kael'reth had specified in his report as the required response path, and Kael'reth received it on the station at 9:17 and was on a transit shuttle within the hour. He arrived at the collective's capital 31 hours after submitting the 15th report. The council chamber was the same chamber he had briefed twice before, in years 2 and 5 of his posting, for the standard diplomatic assessment reviews that the protocol required. It had the formal architecture of institutional authority, not designed to intimidate, which was a cruder technique, but designed to remind everyone present of the weight of the institution they were operating within, the accumulated decision-making of 200 years. He had found it impressive the first time and functional the second time, and today he found it simply the room where he needed to say what he needed to say. He stood before 11 council members and looked at each of them in the way he had learned to look at decision-makers who needed to receive information accurately, which was with the direct attention of someone who considered them capable of understanding what they were going to be told. He had no prepared presentation, no slides, no supporting materials. He said, "I have been the collective's diplomatic attaché to human space for 7 years. I requested 2 extensions of my posting because I had not finished understanding the subject of my assignment. I still have not finished understanding it, but I have understood enough to know that what I have understood is important, and what this council does not understand is dangerous. I am going to use the next 2 hours to give you the briefing that the situation requires." The council was quiet. He talked for 2 hours. He covered the fleet size first, because it was the most precisely quantifiable and the most immediately actionable. He showed them the shipping data analysis, the materials flows that indicated production beyond what the public records showed, the distributed production component, the calculation that placed the actual fleet at a figure considerably higher than 80. He showed them the trajectory, the rate of increase over the 7 years of his posting, and let them do the arithmetic themselves, because arithmetic that you did yourself was more convincing than arithmetic that someone else did for you. He covered the doctrinal characteristics. He described the conditions-based orientation with the precision of someone who had spent several years articulating it and had learned, through the process of articulation, which analogies worked for audiences that had not experienced it directly. He described the operational implications, what it meant for a force to not stop when territorial objectives were achieved, what it meant to fight until the conditions were achieved rather than until the costs exceeded the benefits. He covered the institutional depth. He walked them through 30 years of operational history in 20 minutes, not the full record. The full record was in the document the Human Diplomatic Office had sent, which he recommended they all read, but the shape of it, the arc of it, what 30 years of continuous operational experience produced in an institutional military culture. And then he stopped. The council waited. He said, "Everything I have described so far is in my 14 reports. The council received those reports. The summaries indicated their content. I understand that the council's assessment was that those reports reflected immersion bias, that my extended posting had produced excessive sympathy for the subject, and distorted my professional judgment in the direction of overestimating human capability. I want to address that assessment directly." He looked at Merv Saul. "The immersion bias assessment is a legitimate professional concern. Extended postings do sometimes produce compromised objectivity. I reviewed my reports this evening looking for evidence of that specific distortion: systematic overestimation of capability, underestimation of vulnerability, emotional investment overriding analytical precision. I did not find it. What I found was the opposite of bias: 17 distinct capability assessments, where my reports diverged from the intelligence consensus, and in 16 of the 17 cases, subsequent operational events confirmed my assessment rather than the consensus. The 17th is still unresolved." He paused. "I am not raising this to defend my professional reputation. I am raising it because the decision to discount my reports based on the immersion bias assessment has produced a strategic situation that I am asking this council to understand clearly." He looked around the room. The intelligence assessment used to support the declaration placed the human fleet at 80 vessels. The actual figure is higher. The intelligence assessment modeled human military response on regional doctrinal norms. Human military doctrine is not regional doctrinal norms. The intelligence assessment did not address the cultural framework within which human military decisions are made. He paused. None of these failures occurred because the intelligence office is incompetent. They occurred because accurate intelligence about a complex civilization requires sustained, embedded, longitudinal observation. And the collective has had 7 years of sustained, embedded longitudinal observation available in my reports, and those reports were discounted. Merv Saul said, carefully, "Atashay Kaelreth, you indicated in your communication that you had something to tell the council that would not appear in any military assessment. You have covered the fleet size, the doctrine, the institutional depth. What is the remaining element?" Kaelreth looked at him. He said, "I have spent 7 years among humans. I have read their history, not summaries of it, the actual documents, the primary sources, the accounts of the people who lived through the events that made them what they are. I have talked to their soldiers and their historians and their diplomats and the ordinary people who live in the spaces between all of those categories. I have watched a civilization that is, in some ways, very young in this region of space and in other ways very old." He paused. "I want to tell you one thing about them that none of the assessments will ever capture, because it is not a capability that shows up in fleet numbers or weapons specifications or doctrinal analysis." The chamber was quiet. "Humans remember," he said. He said it simply, without dramatic weight, because the thing itself had enough weight and adding to it would reduce it. Not in the way that all species remember, not as institutional record or historical archive. They remember personally. Events that happened before any living human was born are events that living humans feel accountable to. The Draken campaign, which ended before most current compact citizens were born, is something that compact citizens know the specific details of and feel the specific weight of as though it happened to them personally. This is not sentiment. It is structural. It is how their civilization maintains continuity across generations. The people who are gone left the memory in the people who came after them, and those people will leave it in the people who come after them, and the chain does not break and does not diminish." He looked around the council. "I want the council to understand what this means for our specific situation. The collective has issued a formal declaration of war against the interstellar human compact. The declaration has been transmitted on public channels. It is in the public record. It is now in the memory." He paused. "Not in the archive, in the memory, in the structure by which human civilization understands itself across time." He let that sit for a moment. "You have not made a political decision that will be resolved politically and set aside when the resolution is achieved. You have created a memory. The compact citizens, the ones alive today and the ones who have not been born yet, will know that the collective issued this declaration. They will know the date. They will know the circumstances. They will know the stated justifications. He looked at Mayor of Saul. And the specific thing I need this council to understand is that their knowing will not diminish with time. In 30 years, human citizens will feel this declaration the way human citizens today feel campaigns that ended before they were born. In 60 years, the same. The memory does not diminish. It accumulates. The chamber was very quiet. A council member near the center of the table, Councillor Vethnar, who had been one of the 4 dissenting votes on the declaration, said, "You are telling us that the declaration itself, regardless of military outcome, has consequences." "Yes," Kael'reth said. "The declaration is itself an event in the human memory structure. Its consequences do not depend on whether military action follows. They do not depend on whether there is a diplomatic resolution. The declaration was made, and it is now in the record that humans carry forward." He paused. "I am not telling you this to argue that the declaration was wrong. I am telling you this because I believe the Council made this decision without this information, and I believe the decision that is still available to you, the deployment, the military action, whether to proceed, should be made with this information." He said, "You have not started a war. You have created a memory. I am asking you to understand the difference before you do anything else." The vote to suspend the declaration pending a full review was 8-3. It was not 11-0, which was what Kael'reth would have needed to feel fully confident. 8-3 was close in the specific way that things were close when they were close enough and no closer, when the margin between what happened and what could have happened was real and present and not comfortable. 8-3, the suspension passed. The military deployment was halted pending the review. He was in the corridor, outside the chamber, when Mayor Saul found him. The High Counselor had the quality, in this moment, of a being who had spent 22 years being right, and was in the process of updating that experience, which was a process that the 22 years had not prepared him for. He was handling it with more dignity than Kael'reth had expected, which was either a sign of genuine character or a sign of effective institutional conditioning, and Kael'reth was not in a position to determine which. Mayor Saul said, "Why didn't you request this audience before the declaration?" Kael'reth said, "I submitted a request for urgent communication when I received the broadcast. I was given a 48-hour response authorization, which was subsequently reduced to 24 hours when my aide flagged the emergency priority. I had been requesting substantive response to my reports for 7 years through normal protocol. I used the emergency direct address protocol when the situation made it appropriate. That was when the declaration was transmitted." Mayor Saul was quiet for a moment. He said, "The immersion bias assessment." "Yes, I was wrong." "Yes," Kael'reth said, "with respect you were." Mayor Saul held his gaze. He did not look away. Kael'reth found this in a small and specific way, reassuring, a being who had been wrong and knew it, and held your eyes while you confirmed it was a being who was engaging with the reality of the situation rather than managing it. Mayor Saul said, "What happens now with the humans, the suspension, does it help?" Kael'reth thought about Walsh. He thought about 4 years of conversations in her office, about the things she had taught him, and the things he had taught her, and the specific understanding that had developed between them, which was the understanding that came from 2 people genuinely trying to cross the distance between different kinds of knowing and sometimes succeeding. He said, "It helps. They will respond to the suspension with a diplomatic communication. They will propose a formal meeting. They will negotiate in good faith because that is what they do first, always, before anything else. They prefer working to fighting, and they always have. The suspension tells them that the collective is capable of reconsidering, which matters to them. It matters because a party capable of reconsidering is a party you can negotiate with." He paused. He said, "They will not forget that this happened. The declaration is in the memory. That cannot be undone. but they are not a species that demands the past be unmade before they engage with the present. They understand that the past is the past and the present is where the work is. If the collective engages the present honestly and in good faith, the humans will engage the present honestly and in good faith. He paused. That is not optimism. That is what 7 years of observation produces. Mayor Saul said, and if the suspension had not passed, if the fleet had deployed. Kael'Reth said, I have spent 7 years with these people. I have read everything they have ever written about themselves in any form that I could access. I have talked to their soldiers and their historians and the ordinary people who live their lives without thinking much about what their civilization is, who know what it is anyway because they are it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the answer to what would have happened is not a military assessment. It is not a fleet comparison or a doctrine analysis or a capability review. It is the specific thing that happens when a species with 10,000 years of experience with war, with the full weight of what war is and what it costs, and what it means when someone imposes it on you, is given sufficient reason to set aside the deep preference against it that those 10,000 years have also produced. He looked at Mayor of Saul. They don't want war. They are very good at it. The combination is more dangerous than either alone. We were very fortunate that the emergency protocol existed and that you authorized the audience before the fleet deployed. I would like the council to understand that clearly and completely. Mayor of Saul held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the specific economy of a being who had received information and was not going to perform his reception of it as larger or smaller than it was. He walked away. Kael'Reth stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he booked a transit back to Reach Station. He was in Walsh's office by the following evening. She had tea this time, for both of them, which was a habit she had developed at some point in 4 years without either of them formally deciding it was a habit, the way habits developed in relationships that had enough time in them. He sat in his chair and she sat in hers, and he told her what had happened. He told her about the council and the 2 hours and the 8-3 vote and the corridor conversation with Mayor Saul. He told her about the 14 reports and the sequence of reading them, and what the sequence showed that the individual reports didn't show. He told her about the 15-minute period after the vote where he had stood in the corridor outside the chamber and understood, with complete clarity, how close it had been. She listened, she said, good. He said, the immersion bias assessment. Mayor Saul thought I had lost professional objectivity because I had spent too long among humans. She looked at him. He said, I don't think he was entirely wrong. She said, explain. He said, I think I have developed something that the immersion bias framework doesn't have a category for. Not the loss of objectivity, but the acquisition of a different kind of objectivity. The objectivity that comes from being close enough to understand rather than far enough to be detached. I think those are different things, and I think the second kind produces better assessments than the first. He paused. But I also think that 7 years among humans has given me something that goes past professional assessment, something that is not analysis, something that is closer to what Walsh described as the memory structure, except from the outside looking in. I carry what I have learned about them in a way that is different from how I carry information about other subjects. It has weight that other information does not have. Walsh looked at him for a long moment. She said, that's what all good historians think about their best work. He sat with this. He said, was I right about what I told the council, the memory, the accumulation, the difference between starting a war and creating a memory? Walsh looked at him for a long moment. She was a historian. She had spent her career thinking about exactly this question from the inside, thinking about what it meant that her species carried its history the way it did, why it was that events from before her birth were events she felt personally, what the structure was that made that possible, and what it meant that the structure was real. She said, yes, you were completely right, and I hope you made them understand it. He said, I think I did, I'm not certain. She said, "That's the thing about this work. You're never certain. You do your best and you hope the understanding reaches the people who need it before the situation requires it." He looked at her. He thought about 14 reports and 3-day acknowledgments and immersion bias assessments, and an emergency protocol he had used once in 18 years of service, and a vote that had been 8-3, and the corridor and Mayor of Saul's eyes when he confirmed that yes, with respect, he had been wrong. He thought about the gap between close enough and not close enough, which was the specific gap between the world where the fleet deployed and the world where it didn't, and how small that gap had been, and how the smallness of it was not comfortable and was not the same as safety. He thought about Walsh's phrase, "You do your best, and you hope the understanding reaches the people who need it before the situation requires it." And he thought that this was not optimism either. This was the specific thing that people who did this work learned to live with, the permanent uncertainty of whether the work had reached far enough and whether the reaching had been in time. He was going to spend the rest of his career making sure the collective understood what he had understood, not because he was certain it would work, because it was the work that needed doing, and he was the person who could do it, and those two facts together were sufficient reason. He sat in Walsh's office on Reach Station, and he thought about 7 years of watching a species, and 2 hours of explaining what 7 years produced, and a vote that had passed with 3 votes to spare, and a corridor conversation with a man who had looked him in the eyes, while receiving information that his 22 years of being right had not prepared him for. He thought close was enough. Close was what you had when you were fortunate, and being fortunate was not the same as being safe, and the difference between those two things was the specific thing that the rest of his career was going to be about. He picked up his tea. Outside the window, Reach Station's docking approach showed the ordinary traffic of a station going about its business. Ships arriving and departing, the patient essential movement of an interstellar civilization maintaining itself, the vast complicated ordinary work of a region of space that had, for now, not started a war with the species that lived at its edge. For now, he was going to make sure for now became something more durable than it currently was, and he was going to do it through the only mechanism available to him, which was the work, report after report, conversation after conversation, the slow, patient accumulation of understanding in the people who needed to have it. It was not certain to work. It was the only thing available. He drank his tea and thought about the 15th report and what the 16th would need to say. And outside the window, the ships kept moving through the docking approach in the patient, efficient way of things that had been doing necessary work for a long time and expected to keep doing it.